Welcome to Maximus Call-in Radio show number 10. Tonight we had some really great call-in questions about dealing with anxiety when you have a big event coming up. We had a question about the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, and sort of how do you reconcile these archetypes with sort of science and evidence. We had some questions about measuring your free and total testosterone and how do you optimize your hormone functioning. So for all this and more, check out the rest of this call-in radio show.
I was reading King, Warrior, Magician, Lover.
Mm-hmm.
It's an incredible book. And this is more of a little bit more philosophical question. How do you, this is something that he, I would say, dreamt up, to use a terrible word. So how does one reconcile this whole Jungian philosophy of archetypes with evidence-based? For me, it's a big block of reading any of this material.
Right.
It's like, it sounds like reading an ancient epic.
Yeah, it's fair enough. So it's a great question. And for people who, just to give you a little bit of context, Ritesh is asking about a classic book that I actually really love and recommend called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. In fact, if you look at my Twitter profile, it actually has the emoji for all four of those. And so that's my little like signal to the world. I actually had someone DM me the other day. I don't mention the words. I just have the emojis, and people who've read the book, they're like, "Is that King, Warrior, Magician, Lover?" And I'm like, "Yeah, good eye." So it's kind of just like a fun code for people in the know. But it's a great book. It's written by Robert Moore and Doug Gillette. Robert Moore was actually a Jungian analyst and a real expert in that philosophy and school of thought. I am not a Jungian analyst. My primary orientation, as I was answering Ben's question, is ACT, but I'm somewhat familiar with the work. And I, like you, Ritesh, really try to only kind of entertain things that are scientifically based, right? So I literally teach and practice evidence-based therapy. And so it's a great question because I think about this too. Like, how do I reconcile, Moore and Gillette's work, which is not empirically derived, right? He didn't like do a study and decide, okay, there are 4 parts or selves to you, and they are the king, warrior, magician, lover. That's what he kind of calls them, right? But do these actually exist? Who knows, quite frankly. But I think, one of the things, there's 2 ways that I reconcile this. One of the philosophies that come from ACT, and you kind of heard me say this when I was talking to Ben too, about all the different techniques that you can use to manage anxiety. Ultimately, the rubric of something is it effective, right? Or is it useful? Now, I do think it is useful to know if an underlying theory is sound or grounded in science, right? Because it could be effective for another reason. Maybe it's just a placebo effect, right? That's why we do double-blind randomized control trials, to make sure that even if something is effective, it's not just due to the power of placebo or belief. But in this context, the question is, do these sort of 4 masculine archetypes, are these useful for being a better man? And I would argue this book has been around for so long. It's been read by so many people. It's certainly a framework that's used in neo-Jungian psychotherapy. So I would say the accumulation of a lot of clinical evidence in terms of psychotherapy and a lot of just anecdotal, quite frankly, evidence from people who've read the book, incorporated it into their lives. The overwhelming feedback that I've gotten from people who've read it and heard it or used it as part of their therapy practice has been overwhelmingly positive. So I would say on the basis of that, a lot of books get published. They may be popular for a little while and they kind of fall out of favor or fall out of print. This book is a kind of perennially popular, at least within the circle of people who are interested in it, particularly I would say for guys who are interested in being more mature, more effective men. And so I think it's very aligned with that sort of do what works philosophy. And then in terms of the underlying principle, I actually do think it is very aligned with a particular process in ACT called self as context, or otherwise known as self as story, right? So in ACT, one of the things that we talked about earlier was diffusing from your thoughts, diffusing from your feelings, meaning that you don't take your thoughts and feelings literally because they're not always accurate. Sometimes they in fact deceive or lie to you, right? You can feel anxious about something that's not legitimately a threat, right? Like you're worried about contracting some rare disease, and like the odds are like 1 in 1 million of that happening, right? So, thoughts and feelings are obviously not true all the time. And so it's not useful to listen to them or take them literally. Sometimes they're just thoughts. And by the way, people have a lot of experience of this. People have all kinds of intrusive, crazy thoughts all the time about, am I going to jump off a cliff? Am I going to harm this baby? They're just random thoughts, but it doesn't mean we're going to act on them, right? And in fact, when people believe that they act on them, that's how they get sort of OCD or manifest their presentation as having OCD. So just as we diffuse from thoughts and feelings, we can also diffuse from our story or a narrative about ourselves, right? All of us have a story about ourselves where Ben's story might be, I am a doctor, therefore I am smart and competent and X, Y, and Z, because that's the role that I've signed up to play in modern society. And obviously, if something violates that, you fail your Step 1 exam, or you do something stupid and they're like, man, are you in medical school? That might sort of obviously make us feel bad because it violates that story or that belief about ourselves, right? So if we are too rigidly attached to our story and you say, I can only be smart and competent and I have to be perfect at all times, then yeah, you're going to probably suffer a lot in life. Versus if you even hold your story or your narrative flexibly and just say, hey, look, yes, when I put on the white coat, it's kind of a suit. And yes, there's a role that I play, but it doesn't mean that I'm not a human being. I'm not going to be smart about every single topic. I have flaws, I fail, I make mistakes, just like any human being does. And so when you do mess up, when you do fail, when you do make a mistake, it doesn't violate your self-story as much because you're like, oh, it's just a story. I know that, before going to medical school, I wasn't just a doctor. That wasn't part of my narrative. I was a son. I was a brother. I was just a random guy who likes to play video games. There's many other stories that we create or narratives that we create about ourselves. So we shouldn't rigidly stick to one, right? So that's basically self as context or self as story in act. So that process is part of an evidence-based framework. And so how I integrate it is you can think about, like, if your belief or your story about yourself is just a story, that means there are multiple stories. There's multiple narratives that you can create about yourself. And you can think about it as you go through life. You probably will create more, right? When you get married, you take on a new story or role as a husband. And obviously, as you have children, you take on this new role as a father, right? So you create like the subsequent chapters to your story, which evolve over the lifespan. And so accordingly, I think you can fit in those masculine archetypes as essentially multiple selves or different parts of you, right? And so if you don't like the title sort of king, warrior, magician, lover, I think about it really practically, right? Which is, instead of saying, is it true that every man has a king, warrior, magician, lover inside of them? You can think about them as kind of value domains, right? The king archetype represents the leadership of the self, right? It's the part of you that is hopefully a little bit in charge and kind of curates or is like the executive chairman of your board. It provides, blessings and guidance to all the part of you. And so that's the part of you that can help accept yourself and provide direction and make sure that you're heading in the right direction in life. The warrior is obviously the physicality. You can think about that as the health domain. So, obviously we talked a lot about optimizing your health. So that's the part of you that's responsible for that. The magician, if you think about it, is sort of the intellect, the creativity, the part of you that's responsible for your professional development and career success. And then finally, the lover obviously is responsible for your relationships, whether intimate or otherwise. And so if you ask any guy, is your, being a leader and being in charge of your life important to you? Is your health important to you? Is your career important to you? And are your relationships important to you? Clearly, yes. They're almost like 4 universal domains that are valuable to people. And so as part of that, I think it's a very useful framework to think about, well, if these 4 things that are important to me, they may be competing with one another, right? Obviously, we spend a lot of time as men on our careers, sometimes to the detriment of our health or our relationship, or sometimes if, in kind of Ben's example, we're pulled away from the things that we need to do because we're trying to fight or avoid our anxiety. We're not exercising sort of leadership of the self, right? There's another part of us that's just like kind of the scared little boy who doesn't want to fail his step 1 exams. That's taking us away from a valued direction in our lives. And so it can be useful to think about that, a lot of times it may be helpful to explain why we don't always do the things that we know we need to do, right? Rationally, we know procrastination is not a helpful thing, yet all of us, including myself, do it quite often, right? And so I think it's a useful framework to realize, it's not like we're idiots. We know that it's not in our self-interest to procrastinate. But if you think about, it's not just us, but there's 4 parts of us, right? The king, warrior, magician, lover, health, physicality, relationships, and intellect/creativity. They're almost like warring energies or competing energies, which makes sense then why we would procrastinate, because these things are almost like vying for control. And so if you recognize that and you say, okay, these are different parts of myself, just like you don't buy into any particular story or belief about yourself, you can essentially address these different components. And almost like I said, as the king, leader, chairperson of your life, you can essentially talk to these different parts of yourselves. You can reconcile them. You can even maybe negotiate and make compromises, right? Where you can say, hey, to Katerina's point, from now until April, when I have to study for this step 1 exam, I'm going to be very focused on the kind of this magician/professional side of myself in order to ace this exam and accelerate my professional development. Now, this may come at the detriment of the lover in terms of my relationships, right? I'm not going to heavily invest. I'm not going to be going out a lot. And so that part of me may be upset and screaming out because I feel lonely. I feel disconnected socially. I may be lacking physical touch and intimacy. And so how do I reconcile that? So you may literally have conversations with yourself and say, okay, in order to get your cooperation to study really hard Monday through Friday, on the weekend, I'm going to allow myself to go get a massage, right? And because I appreciate sort of physical touches, or maybe I'll go on a date, or maybe I'll go out and have dinner with a group of friends in order to build that relationship. So are you willing to kind of give me kind of a couple days of solid work in order to let me kind of give you what you want in terms of physical and social connection, intimacy, etc.? So it's almost like, if you think about it, you're like the father of I like to say 3 boys, and you are constantly negotiating. You're not supposed to be an authoritarian leader and just be like, all you do is work and study all day. We know that if we do that, that backfires, right? We get this kind of rebelliousness, procrastination parts of you because, look, you're a human being, and there's other needs than just one singular need to be a professional or whatever that you're kind of pursuing doggedly or single-mindedly. You have to kind of negotiate these different parts of you, which I think is very in line with this sort of self-story kind of process. So that's how I kind of think about it. That's how I kind of work with clients around this, is if I see a lot of acting out or a lot of procrastination or a lot of I say I want to do something, but I can't kind of will myself to do it. Instead of just trying to push some more, you may want to kind of explore, what are sort of these competing, whether you want to call them selves, energies, or archetypes that may be, pulling someone in the wrong direction, and they may not be attending to, or they might have banished those parts of themselves, and they kind of sit in the shadow, as Jung would say, and they cause trouble. And so how we do that is we kind of re-welcome them into the fold, bring them back into the light, engage, acknowledge, and validate those parts of us that we may have been ignoring, and saying, okay, I have to be a reasonable human being. I have to give you what you want and your needs to a reasonable degree as well, so that I can elicit your cooperation and we can kind of work together as one to be the man that we want to be.
Thank you. That was truly incredible. I haven't read the whole book yet, but I think your explanation actually appeals to me more than sort of books, more sort of archetypes. So.
Fair enough. And for people who are really interested in this, I have a couple different recommendations. If you want to just kind of get like the TLDR version of it, I believe there's a blog where that summarized King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. I believe it's Art of Charm or Art of Manliness. We'll put the links after the show. It'll give you like a nice like 5 to 10 page summary of it. That's a great starting place. If you're really interested, obviously go buy the book and read it. I think it's fantastic. And if you're super interested after reading the book, he actually published one book per archetype. There's a whole book on the King, whole book on the Warrior, etc. that really deep dives into it. And there's also a YouTube series where he has 24 hours of lecture material. If you really want to just go down the, Robert Moore Jungian rabbit hole, it definitely does get a little bit esoteric once you're getting into that level of content. But if you love it, then feel free to do it. One final thing is there's a great YouTube channel called like Stories of Old, I believe it's called. And he uses movies to depict the archetypes, right? So he takes like Lord of the Rings to exemplify the King archetype, because obviously Return of the King is literally one of the movies of Lord of the Rings. Moonlight, I think, to portray the lover archetype, etc. And so he uses really classical film descriptions and does a wonderful job. They're only like 5 to 10 minutes long, these YouTube videos, to describe the archetype in a really full and rich way. And you could tell like he's read all the books, and so he uses the movies to kind of explain them in a really neat way, which I really love and I highly recommend. So check those out as well. So it's a great resource.
Definitely.
Cool. So yeah, we have a question from last week from Sebastian via Discord. He asked, hi, I'm 27 years old, got blood test results today. So far, total testosterone seems pretty low, even if in range. Total testosterone, 4.21 ng/ml. Free testosterone, 21.7 pg/ml. Comments? Thank you.
Did they provide the reference ranges for those? Okay. So that's the first thing that I would say is, so it sounds like this caller has gotten their total and free testosterone levels checked, which is great. And I think we've talked about in previous radio shows. I actually suggest all adult men, as part of their annual physical exam, ask their physician to, do a routine blood test. And if they're willing, also to check their hormone levels, just to, make sure that you're not only not having low testosterone, but also making sure that they're optimal as well. So you can't sort of interpret it without the reference ranges. What a reference range is usually when you get a lab result, you also get what's called a reference range. And usually that's a 95% confidence interval. So it'll say for, men, adult men, this is basically, the 2.5 percentile to the 97th and a half percentile, and kind of the 95 percentiles in between. So if you're within the normal range, or you're within that bound, which applies to 95% of people, then your levels are considered normal. The thing that I think is really important to distinguish, though, is just because your levels are not abnormal does not mean your hormone levels or any other reference range are optimal. There's a difference between abnormal and unoptimal. Abnormal, by definition, means your levels have to be in the 2.5 percentile or lower, which is really, really low testosterone levels. If you were looking at like a total testosterone level, and most of the reference ranges are usually between like 300 and 900, I believe, nanograms per deciliter, if I'm getting the units right. This person, I think, chimed in, and Victor, you said it was like 4.21. This is a different scale, essentially, that they're using. So it's hard for me to interpret. But most of the time, total testosterone is kind of in that 300 to 900 range. Your levels would have to be in kind of the 200s or lower to be considered deficient, or what's clinically called hypogonadal. But that doesn't mean it's optimal, right? Like your levels could be in the 5th percentile, meaning 95% of guys are higher than you, and you're still considered normal. So reference ranges are really only telling you if you're extreme, essentially, right? You have an extreme abnormality, or same thing on the higher end, that you're extremely high in some rare cases. I generally think kind of 300 to 900 is the general reference range, but the more like median amount is, I would say, more like 400 to 600 is what like an average guy will have. But I would argue optimal levels are closer to that, 750, 800, 850, 900 range. That would put you in like the 75th, 80th, 90th percentile range. So that's how I would interpret those results. I do think free testosterone is a more useful measure than total testosterone. So just a really, really quick physiological lesson. Testosterone is basically bound to two different proteins. One's called albumin and the other one is called SHBG, or sex hormone binding globulin. These basically inhibit the function of testosterone in terms of binding to the androgen receptor. And so you measure free testosterone. So that's the unbound form of the testosterone that's not bound to albumin or sex hormone binding globulin that can freely bind to the androgen receptor. So that's the one that's responsible for the biological activity like building muscle that people associate with testosterone. The only tricky thing about free testosterone, though, is you have to make sure that you're measuring the right kind. So if you go to a Quest or a LabCorp, which are the two major labs in the United States, make sure if you're going and getting the test that, first of all, it's LCMS. LCMS is liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. It's just basically a more accurate version of the test versus what's called an immunoassay. And then on top of that, you want to make sure you're getting the right LCMS test. I know this is very complicated, but Quest, if you go to Quest, automatically their LCMS test is the right one, and that's an equilibrium dialysis. That's considered the gold standard, the most accurate version of free testosterone. If you go to LabCorp, however, you have to specify that. So I think there's two ones that are good, two types of tests that are good. One's called equilibrium dialysis. The other one's called ultrafiltration method. They're both LCMS tests. Those are what are considered the more accurate free testosterone measures. If you just kind of get the immunoassay free testosterone, it's directionally accurate. I'm not saying it's totally inaccurate, but it's not as good as the gold standards. So that's the best way. That's the most accurate way to measure free testosterone. If you don't have sort of the time or money or means to go get that, the easier way of doing it is just get your total testosterone level checked. I do prefer LCMS for that test as well. It's a little bit more accurate than the LCMS. But the other thing you can do is, if you're getting it done as part of your routine blood work, albumin is automatically measured as part of a CBC or CMP. And so you'll know that number. And then you're going to ask for a second test, which is that SHBG protein that I mentioned. Basically, my recommendation is get a total testosterone and an SHBG and then calculate it yourself, or get a very accurate free testosterone. But if you do, make sure you get the right one, which is an LCMS equilibrium dialysis test. So I know that was a lot, but these are all recorded. You can go back and just listen to the podcast to make sure that you pick up the right ones. Or if you have any questions, just go to our Discord channel. We have a Dr. Cam radio show, and I'll type these things out so that you can have them for your reference. And you can bring it up with your doctor when you want to ask them about getting these labs measured. So finally, when you get these numbers, you can kind of look up for your age bracket what is kind of age appropriate. Because obviously, if you're 70 versus you're 20, your testosterone levels may be different. They do tend to go down generally about 1% per year. So you can kind of like roughly do the math there. So, if you're young, you'd want your testosterone levels, like I said, to be maybe 600-ish, right? The top of that 400 to 600 kind of median range that I mentioned. And it'll kind of slowly decline with age, where if you're kind of middle-aged, maybe it's closer to 500. If you're very elderly, maybe it's closer to 400, right? So I would say, yeah, that's why 400 to 600 is a useful range for everyone. A little bit higher for young people, a little bit lower for older people. You can kind of ballpark yourself. Now, if we're talking about optimization, which I think a lot of people in this community care about, you really want to get to that top of that range, where I said, like I said, getting to 800, getting to 900, so that you can be, essentially kind of an alpha male, if you want to, physiologically describe it as such. There's a lot of things that you can do. I mentioned some of these on Twitter. In terms of the lifestyle behaviors that we should do. Obviously, you should try to get 7 to 9 hours of sleep. there's clear research that shows that testosterone is linearly correlated with up to 8 hours of sleep. So people who get 8 hours of sleep have more testosterone than guys who get 7 or 6 or less hours of sleep. So sleep is by far the best foundational behavior that you can do to make sure that you're endogenously or naturally producing as much testosterone as possible. You should obviously eat a healthy anti-inflammatory diet. Anti-inflammatory meaning, don't eat a bunch of refined, ultra-processed junk food, right? The less nutrition labels, quite frankly, the better. Eat like meat, seafood, produce, fruits, vegetables that don't have any nutrition labels. Those are naturally anti-inflammatory. It's the easiest rule of thumb to follow. The other particular thing, though, if we're talking about hormone optimization, is you do want to consume a reasonable amount of saturated fats, including cholesterol, because that's a substrate for converting into hormones such as testosterone. So like things like egg yolks, red meat, the natural fatty acids that are found in fish and seafood are all helpful substrates for optimal testosterone production. And the other thing I might say, though, is generally, although I am a fan of lower carb diets, if you're doing extreme low carb or extreme low calories, it may be harmful to testosterone production. So if you're eating zero carbs or you're at a less than, let's say, greater than 200 caloric deficit, it may not be optimal. So you can still eat relatively low carb and still be in keto. We've talked about this. If you're dropping weight, you want to do it gradually. So you're cutting, let's say, 100 to 200 calories a day, and you're kind of gradually losing the weight. But if you go on a crash diet and you're doing anything extreme, it can kind of disrupt hormone functioning. So I would just say be careful about doing any sort of extremely low carb, extremely low calorie, or extreme intermittent fasting. Same thing, where you're fasting for very long periods of time. They can kind of screw around with your hormones. So make sure you optimize your nutrition. Obviously, we talked a lot with Ben's question about optimizing, managing your stress. So make sure your cortisol levels aren't through the roof. Cortisol is catabolic and kind of counteracts the effect of testosterone. Optimal intimate relationships. Obviously, if you're spending time with a partner, you're sexually active, there's a lot of touch and intimacy involved, that can actually increase testosterone levels. We are social creatures. There's in fact even evidence that like rooting for your favorite team and having them win at a baseball or football game increases your testosterone, at least temporarily or acutely. But yeah, you don't discount the social factor, as well. And then same thing, if you're spending so much time in front of a computer, I don't think there's a lot of clear research on this, but mechanistically it makes sense that if you're addicted to the internet, pornography, gaming, and you're spending hours a day on it, it's probably not going to be optimal for your testosterone versus getting outside in the sun, spending time in clean fresh air and getting vitamin D produced through the conversion in your skin is going to be much better for your testosterone production, I would argue, than sitting under a bunch of artificial light and the glow of the computer screen. So make sure you're getting sunlight and getting enough endogenous vitamin D production. Obviously, if you live, it's wintertime in a place that doesn't get a lot of sun, you may want to optimize your vitamin D levels in order to have that support your testosterone levels. And finally, this is something that our company is working on as well. We're going to have some very, very interesting, cool stuff that we'll talk about later that can help people really get up to those optimal ranges, just like professional athletes and people who are, functioning at a very high performance level have.
Yeah, so my question kind of revolves around the fact that my med school class is really preparing for our first board exam now.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really high stakes exam, has a huge role in the residency selection process. And it's been hard to watch classmates kind of struggle under the stress of this process.
Mm-hmm.
People that I've known for a year and a half now, and you're watching like their personality change, and watching them struggle with this. I think part of what's weird about it is it's almost like it's an acute stress that you're feeling for a long period of time,
right,
as you're preparing for this exam months ahead of time. So I wondered what ideas, resources, are kind of out there to help folks deal with this, as well as anything that's worked for your clients who dealt with these situations. It could even be something like a divorce that's you're dealing with an acute stressor for a long period of time.
Yeah. Well, maybe the best proxy is any sort of event where it kind of all falls on one day, because you do take the exam and over the course of, is it one day? Is that correct?
Yep. it's one day, and for most of us, it's at the end of April. So you're crunch time now, where like it's coming up, and it feels a lot more real, I think, for a lot of folks.
For sure. So I think, whether or not you're a medical student, it could be an athlete waiting for a big game day. It could be an employee waiting for an annual performance review, or anything where it kind of falls upon one particular momentous occasion. I think there can be a lot of anticipatory anxiety in these kind of situations, which can build up and almost become like a huge burden on people's backs. Especially when it has a lot of, real and tangible implications. Obviously, how you do on, this exam, it doesn't determine, I would say your entire career as a physician, but it can, at least point you in the right direction if you're trying to, get into a competitive residency program per se. So, the thing is, first of all, I validate, people going through that process. I train actually psychiatry residents who've gone through that when they were medical students. So, I don't think there's like an easy or quite frankly quick solution to just dealing with an ominous anxiety that's hanging over your head until you take an exam in April. But maybe as a place to start, Ben, I'd actually love, I assume you're in the same class that you're referring to, so I'd love to hear actually how you're thinking about it and approaching it and handling it.
Yeah, I don't know if this is the correct term for it, but I think it's more of like a stoic philosophy, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I know this is out there. I know, I've got a study plan laid out. I've got the steps I'm going to take. And really, I think for me personally, beyond that, any additional worry, anxiety, things like that isn't productive. It doesn't help you. It just kind of gets you more wired up. It can even be distracting when you're studying.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I've kind of tried to channel the original anxiety and things into making the study plan. Now it's just kind of, for me, it's sticking to the plan. But I've just noticed a lot of my classmates feel like more worked up, more anxious, and it's gotten to the point where, it's noticeable in everyday interactions and things like that.
Yeah. I think this is part of the issue too, is when you're surrounded by it, there's almost this like affect contagion is what we call it in psychology. It's like the emotions are contagious in and of themselves. And so if you have people who are stressed or freaking out, it rubs off on other people because they start thinking to themselves, oh, should I be, am I not sufficiently worried? If this person started taking it seriously, am I not taking it seriously enough? Which, it makes sense from, evolutionary context. If you're like in a village or tribe-like context and someone has a ton of anxiety, maybe they know something that you don't know. And there's almost like a negative FOMO that's happening. So, and so it's useful to have people talk through that and almost be a little bit more realistic in their thinking, so that they don't think they've created this very black and white scenario where the only way to be happy in life is to be a dermatologist. Otherwise, I'm a miserable human being. It's useful to kind of diffuse from those thoughts, right? So you can notice, like, as you're sitting there and you're studying for the step 1 exam, right? You're in the library and you're trying to focus, but this thought keeps popping up. Oh my God, what if I fail this exam? Oh my God, what if I don't become a dermatologist? What will I do? Life will be terrible. I will be unhappy. And you can just notice that script or that narrative playing out. So instead of it being right in front of your face and it's all sort of consuming you and you're believing it to be true, you just kind of look at it a little bit from a distance and be like, okay, thanks mind for giving me this thought. I'm trying to study right now, but I know you're trying to protect me. I know you're trying to make sure that I do well on this exam, but this is not particularly helpful at this present moment. So you can keep on talking or chitter chattering in the background, but I'm going to reorient my attention to focusing on this exam. So in that exercise, what you're doing is you're sort of de-literalizing thoughts. You're not taking them literally. So you don't have to sit there and necessarily dispute them or argue with that part of you that's worried, right? Because maybe that's kind of like your amygdala response of it's kind of fear-driven irrationality. You can just acknowledge and say, hey, look, there's maybe a different, more primal part of me that's just always going to be afraid. And I just care too much about being a great doctor that I'm always going to be a little bit anxious. So my job is just every time those sort of thoughts pop up, I can just recognize them. I can see them for what they are. And I don't need to attend to them. I don't need to ruminate excessively on them. I can just kind of watch them come and go like leaves on a stream. and just let them drift by and reorient my attention. The other part of it that I think really though is critical is also, which comes from ACT, is a willingness to experience the negative emotion, right? As you mentioned, when you're observing your classmates, right, as the date comes closer and closer to the exam, people get more and more worked up, right? They're feeling the anxiety. And so what starts to happen is a lot of avoidance behaviors, right? People start procrastinating because they're like, oh, just sitting there, and even the act of studying reminds me of this, momentous occasion, and I don't like feeling anxious. And so I'm going to put it off. I'm going to watch my Netflix. I'm going to do whatever I do to numb, distract, or avoid myself from those feelings. And so to almost take the opposite approach, I think it's actually very useful, particularly working with students that are probably, naturally going to be anxious to some degree. It's changing the objective, which is saying, look, you don't need to make the anxiety go away in order to study for this exam. In fact, we know from research, there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson law, which I probably mentioned before. A moderate amount of anxiety actually helps you. If you had zero anxiety, right, you shut off your stress response with a beta blocker, which dampens your sympathetic nervous system, you'd actually be really sleepy, and it probably impairs, in fact, your working memory. Now, on the other hand, you don't want too much anxiety where you're sitting there like jittery because you're hopped up on caffeine and you're worried that, the world is going to be over. You want that happy Goldilocks zone of moderate amount of anxiety, actually. And so if you think about it from that perspective, you want some anxiety. And in fact, you should be practicing a willingness to have that anxiety and bring it along with you as kind of a companion for the ride. And so just as I'm sort of using this externalization to talk about thoughts, you can do the same thing with your feelings and just say, hey, look, I don't like anxiety. I wouldn't necessarily want anxiety in this moment, but it's going to be there anyway. So I might as well just kind of bring it along with me. When I go study in my cubicle, I feel it in my sort of chest and belly. But I'm not going to sit there and procrastinate just because I have those feelings. I don't need to make them go away. I don't need to wait for them to dissipate or go down. I can just literally study with a 50% moderate amount of anxiety and bring it along for the ride. So that willingness is a totally different metric, right? So instead of saying I need to make my anxiety go away, you're just saying, in fact, I need to just increase my willingness. So if you think about them as almost like two volume knobs, right? The metaphor that we describe it in ACT is, if you think about your anxiety on a 0 to 10 scale, let's say you or your classmates' anxiety is an 8 out of 10, right? So pretty high level of anxiety. And you're doing all these efforts to try to make that anxiety go down. But the thing that you notice is every time you push the knob down, it comes back up. You procrastinate for an hour, your anxiety goes down, and then it comes right back up when it's time to study, right? It's not a good long-term solution. Instead of trying to fight this battle with your anxiety in terms of constantly playing whack-a-mole and trying to get it to go down, the alternative is to just increase your willingness, right? People's willingness to anxiety may be a 2 out of 10. And so 8 minus 2 is 6. So 6 is basically the suffering that you're experiencing because you are unwilling to experience your anxiety. And so the cure for that, which is not the cure for anxiety, the cure for that cure for suffering, I should say, is to increase your willingness. So if your willingness is an 8 out of 10 and your anxiety is an 8 out of 10, the difference is 0 and you have no suffering, right? You have some unpleasant anxiety, which is clean pain. It's natural, but you're not sitting there and having any unnecessary suffering or dirty pain that comes from the unwillingness to have the anxiety, right? The more that we try to resist it, essentially, the worse that it gets. So instead of making anxiety the enemy, I always say try to make anxiety your friend. Literally befriend it and say, hey, look, you're going to be here anyway. Maybe I didn't necessarily want or wish you to be here, but if you're going to be here, let's be allies. Let me make you my friend and you can come along for the ride. Because to my point earlier, I do need some of you and to care enough about this to put in my full effort. And then, maybe I didn't wish it was an 8 out of 10. Maybe I wish it was a 5. But I'm not going to play that game of trying to reduce my anxiety because it probably just actually rebounds and makes it worse. So all I'm going to focus on is cultivating a willingness to have an anxiety. And if you do that, then it's like you're stepping out of the battle, right? It's like instead of playing tug of war with your anxiety, you're dropping the rope is the metaphor that we make and saying, you know what? I'm a first-year medical student. I care about this exam. I want to be a dermatologist. I acknowledge and I own that fully. And that means I'm going to have a little bit of anxiety, and that's okay. I'm willing to have it. I don't need to make it go away. I don't need to vent to all my classmates. I don't need to make other people nervous. I can just hold it as a mature man and saying, yes, I have it. I own it. I feel a little bit of anxious, but it's not a problem. It's not a problem. And the more that you tell yourself that and you actually genuinely believe it's not a problem, then it becomes an ally, and you get step out of the struggle, which allows you the freedom to focus on what you need to do, which is to do what as well as you can on this exam, and obviously live the rest of your life. So those are a couple of really good evidence-based techniques from both CBT and ACT in order to deal with anxiety. And you can kind of go through, you can use it step by step. You can do the cognitive restructuring, reducing the unrealisticness of, the thoughts, decatastrophizing, and then moving on to using sort of mindfulness and willingness techniques. Or if you want to just skip to a little bit of the ACT stuff and use just mindfulness and willingness, and you find that's effective, then use that too. My kind of philosophy when it comes to psychology is, look, use what's effective and discard the rest. So you have to kind of try out these different techniques, see what's effective, and use what's good for you. Just one last note. Actually, one of our callers wanted to chime in, who's actually one of our female listeners. She says she kind of goes into her own version of Buddhist monk mode and just makes a checklist that she follows every day that includes things like meditation, working out, etc. So sometimes structure, to her point, can be very helpful too. It's just saying, hey, look, I'm going to have a really busy life between now and April when I take this exam. So let me schedule in not only my studying, but my self-care, and just go through it kind of like a warrior monk. And so then it's not so much of like a tug of war battle of like, what do I need to do every single day? It's just like, okay, let me go through my routine. I promised my 4 hours of studying. I'm going to do my hour of the gym, my whatever hours of class. And I'm just going to go through and check off the checkbox. And so it becomes a little bit more of a habit in that case, and becomes less sort of discretionary in terms of your behavior, so that things like procrastination don't take over when you've kind of stuck to a rigorous schedule and are on autopilot. All right, that was a lot, but Ben, is that helpful?
Definitely. I've got a page and a half of notes here. I will work on putting that into practice. And I think the one thing that you put a name to that I was struggling with is the avoidance behaviors. Mm-hmm. One of my really close friends, we'll start our kind of really intense, dedicated study period for this in about 3 weeks, and he hasn't even made a study plan yet. And I don't know if he's like thinking about it or that. And I think what's probably at the core of it is this avoidance and not wanting to deal with the issue. So hopefully some of these things can help him overcome that too.
Yeah, I'll add one last technique, which is really helpful for really tough treatment-resistant anxieties, as we would say clinically. When I deal with people who have really bad avoidance behavior, to your point, they're really bad procrastinators, and sort of the cognitive and maybe even some of the behavioral techniques don't work as well. Sometimes I actually take a paradoxical intention and try to a little bit like reverse it on them or shock them out of their pre-existing patterns of behavior that have become, unfortunately, very ingrained, right? So the way that most people operate, which sounds like what your friend is doing, is that they have this internal rule. They may not even be fully aware of it mentally. They're like, I cannot or don't want to feel anxious before I study or do my work, right? And so the way that they do that is they obviously put it off, right? They're like, they notice that their anxiety is rising. They're like, I have to write a study plan. Oh, that makes me too uncomfortable to think about all the pressure. So I'm going to put it off, right? Or they're sitting there and they're like, let me wait for my anxiety to go down. Let me sharpen my pencil. Let me go check my email. Let me check my social media a little bit. And so they're doing all these things to procrastinate because they want to feel good before they start. If that's your goal, that's a disaster. In that you're never going to feel always good or optimal before you start. And if you think about it, think about people who have like a really strict blue collar jobs. They got to literally punch in on the clock on time every single day. For most people, save being unfortunately really sick, they just show up to work every day, no matter how they feel, because they're like, if I don't, I'm going to get fired, right? And so it doesn't become a question of I need to feel good to go to work. It's like, no, I go to work, rain, sleet, or snow, anxiety, sadness, or depression. I just do it anyway. And so it kind of gets out of that procrastinatory mode. And so the reverse or paradoxical approach, sometimes that I'll do if people are willing to kind of be a little bit playful, is I tell them that they should actually rethink their relationship with anxiety. So instead of thinking, like I said, anxiety is a problem and they need to make it go down before they can make a study plan, I actually tell them you need anxiety, and in fact, you should conjure it or welcome it in order to do your study plan, right? And so I tell them, if you don't feel anxious, I actually don't want you to start, right? But if you're feeling slightly anxious, I want you to actually like work yourself up a little bit, like make yourself extra anxious, and then use that and channel that productively into doing a study plan. And so you can obviously understand why that's paradoxical, right? They're like, I need to not feel anxious in order to do my work. And I'm like telling you, no, you need to be anxious to do your work. So try to rile yourself up, try to make yourself anxious. So one of two things happen if they do that. Sometimes, paradoxically, trying to make yourself anxious doesn't work, right? And so they're sitting there and they're like, because when they're trying to make their anxiety down, that doesn't work either. So it's almost like, you know, when you try to force your body to do something, it doesn't listen to you. It's like a unruly teenager, right? In the back of your brain. So ironically, trying to make yourself anxious doesn't work. I'll give you a great similar analogous example to this. I had a client who, it's actually a supervisor's client, who had social anxiety because they blushed, right, in social situations. When they got anxious, their face would turn red, and obviously they'd be very embarrassed. And so the paradoxical intention was my supervisor had this client try to blush in front of a mirror. And ironically, when he was trying to do it, he couldn't blush. When he was trying not to blush, he would blush, right? And so the same thing applies to anxiety, that when we try to make ourselves anxious and we're like, I want to have it go up from a 5 to an 8 to a 10, it often doesn't work, which is, you know, ironically what we want. Or what happens is, let's say you successfully do work up your anxiety and you're thinking about, you know, the catastrophe that's going to happen. But by telling yourself, I want it to be high so that I can study, it's not a problem if it is. So you're like, okay, great. I'm a 9 out of 10 on anxiety now, and now I can start. So you're eliminating the avoidance behavior because by welcoming or in fact conjuring or creating anxiety, you are de facto increasing your willingness. Because by definition, you're saying, I'm not starting until my anxiety is an 8 out of 10. It's a 5 out of 10. I gotta actually work up my anxiety. I gotta increase my anxiety a little bit more in order to start. You're basically creating the opposite rule, which is I can't start until I'm anxious. And so I know it sounds a little crazy or paradoxical, but for some folks who are really, really bad procrastinators, if they really adopt that, now you obviously have to believe that and you have to put it into practice, it can be a very helpful paradoxical intention to just get going.
Perfect. I might have to give that technique a try this weekend. So.
Yeah, and report back. Tell me, I think I shared like 4 different techniques with you. So you have the buffet option of techniques for working with anxiety. But like I said, as Bruce Lee said, take what's useful and leave the rest. So yeah, happy to hear back from you on how that goes. All right, everyone, really, really great questions for today. We will follow up after the show with some show notes. So join us in the Dr. Cam Radio Show channel. I'll put links to all of the YouTube videos, links, books, etc. that I referenced today. So we had a really interesting conversation. Thank you, Ben, for asking the question about how do I deal with anticipatory anxiety and procrastination when you have a big event coming up. We talked a lot about sort of using CBT techniques, ACT techniques, and paradoxical intention techniques to deal with anxiety. Someone asked some really great questions about how do you do hormone testing. And I talked about how to test or calculate total and free testosterone, which we'll follow up and give links about. And also we talked about sort of 5 foundational health behaviors to optimize your testosterone as well. And then Ritesh asked the question about King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, and how do you sort of reconcile that with more modern evidence-based, therapy schools and philosophies. And, I talked about how it sort of integrates with sort of Act's concept of the self as story. And that ultimately, when you're listening to any book or even person like me, you all ultimately have to test it and make sure that it's useful to you in your real life, because that to me is the true litmus test of any philosophy, treatment, or intervention. Is it has to work for you. So engage with it, try it out, and let us know how it works. So thanks for joining us on then, and have a great week, everyone.